One sec, give me a second. Daniel, give me the earphones. Hi everyone, welcome to the 2026 staging of the International Reparations Debate Competition. I'm Jermaine Barrett and I'm happy to be here with you to judge this first match. I'm going to invite Roshana Jarrett now to introduce us to our sponsors for the 2026 season.
Thank you very much, Jermaine. Our sponsors this year is the University of West Indies Mona, UA Press, the Center for Reparation, the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, J Limited, University of Hull, and the Repair Campaign.
You just heard from Roshana, but I'm going to invite my judges to introduce themselves formally now. Of course, I did inform you that I will be the chair adjudicator for this match. And Roshana, please say hello to our audience.
And again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Roshana Jarrett, and I will serve as one of your wing adjudicators. I am looking forward to an exciting clashing of ideas, and may the better team win.
Thank you, Roshana. And our second supporting adjudicator, Javon Downey. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. The name is Javon Downey, and I take it a great pleasure to be here to serve as a wing adjudicator in this match. And I'm looking forward to very scintillating and riveting ideas. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Javon. We're going to get to be introduced to our teams now. We have on-side proposition Charlemont High School out of Jamaica, and on opposition we have Arima North Secondary School out of Trinidad and Tobago. All right, so I'm going to invite our proposition team to introduce themselves now. Charlemont?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tatiana Grant, and I am the Prime Minister for today's debate competition.
Good morning, my name is Genesis McEwan, and I'm the Deputy Prime Minister.
Good morning, my name is Tony K. Young. I'll be the third speaker of the proposition team.
Thank you very much, Charlemont High School. And of course, we turn over now to our opposition team, Arima North Secondary School.
Good morning, all. I'm Leandra Quintero. I will be your Prime Minister for today's debate.
Good morning, all. My name is Tanya Lucas, and I'll be your Deputy Prime Minister for today's debate.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Josiah Russell, and I'll be your third speaker for this debate.
Thank you very much, Arima North out of Trinidad and Tobago. All right, so we are now at that stage where I must introduce you to the rules of the debate, after which I will invite Roshana Jarrett to announce the motion. Then we'll get our match started. So the rules are as follows. Both teams, as you would have just witnessed, have 3 debaters each. Each debater have a different amount of time within which they will be presenting. So the first speaker on each team will speak for 7 minutes, the second speaker will present for 6 minutes, and the third speaker presents for 5 minutes. After the first 2 speakers, that's first proposition and first opposition, will enter an exciting cross-examination segment. And of course, in this segment, the opposition will get a chance to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, followed by the proposition responding to those questions. Then at the end of that phase, we invite the proposition team to rather ask 3 questions of the opposition team. Each question is limited to 10 seconds. Each response limited to 45 seconds. We'll have another segment of cross-examination, wherein in the second segment, of course, the the proposition team gets to ask their 3 questions first of the opposition team, followed by the opposition asking their 3 questions of the proposition team. A note as well in this segment, the questions are limited to 10 seconds. The responses each limited to 45 seconds. We will then pause for 1 minute, and following the pause, we will resume with the reply speakers. First from the opposition team, then we'll conclude our debate overall with the reply speaker from the proposition team. All right. Another thing to note, the first 4 speakers in the debate have what we call protected time. So the debaters will be monitoring and will be looking for messages in the chat where they will be informed as to when they're spoken for 1 minute. Then they will also be informed when they have 1 minute remaining. In between that, those 2 time signals, points of information are allowed. In fact, they are encouraged. And of course, when they've spoken for their allotted time, that will be indicated as well. And then, of course, 10 seconds later, they will be given a signal indicating that time is in fact up. They ought to stop and yield the floor for another speaker. All right. The points of information only apply to the first 4 speakers. There are no points of information permitted for the final speakers, the reply speakers. All right. So with that in mind, I invite Roshana to announce our motion, and then we'll get the match started.
Thank you very much, Jermaine. The motion before this House this morning is this House rejects debt cancellation as an acceptable form of reparation. Just to repeat, this House rejects debt cancellation as an acceptable form of reparation.
Thank you very much. And with that in mind, let us get our debate started. We call upon the first speaker from the proposition team representing Charlemont High School. Let us make that speaker welcome, the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, members of the opposition, distinguished adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant day to you all. We, the government, stand firmly in support of this be it resolved. This House rejects debt cancellation as an acceptable form of reparation. Mr. Speaker, our case is that debt forgiveness may be sound economic policy, but conceptually, morally, and structurally, it is not reparative justice. Let me begin with definitions, because precision matters in debate of justice. Chevy R.G. Eugene, in his paper Towards a Framework for Caribbean Reparations, Journal of the Eastern Caribbean Studies 2019, defined that the reparations argument is more than physical or psychological. It is about the immiserating poverty and economic impotence in the contemporary Caribbean that can be traced to the slave trade and history of slavery in the region. Chevy further stated that the Caribbean reparations movement is a moral, legal, and political response to the crime against humanity committed during the European imperial project. By debt forgiveness, we mean the cancellation or restructuring of sovereign debt owed by states to creditors, including multilateral institutions, private lenders, or foreign governments. This is the language used by institutions such as the International Monetary Fund in its debt sustainability framework. Mr. Speaker, we can therefore narrow the motion that the idea that debt forgiveness does not meet the conceptual threshold of reparations. I will make the argument debt forgiveness or cancellation does not morally or sufficiently link perpetrator and harm. My second speaker will show that even if we ignore moral theory and judge this proposal and whether it works in practice, debt cancellation still fails. Mr. Speaker, the primary focus of reparations, as framed by the CARICOM Reparations Commission, established by CARICOM heads of government in 2013, is clear. It is to hold responsible those European powers that engage in centuries of enslavement, dehumanization, and colonial exploitation of Caribbean peoples. Reparations are, at their core, about responsibility flowing from perpetrator to victim. However, members of the opposition may be surprised to learn that most Caribbean debt today is not owed to former colonial states. Yes, opposition, we acknowledge that Caribbean debt levels are high. According to a First Citizens Group analysis of Caribbean public debt, Caribbean economies, excluding Haiti, have averaged a debt-to-GDP ratio of approximately 90.1% since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, well above standard developing economy benchmarks. but the source of that debt matters. According to the International Monetary Fund's Public Debt Profile and Public Debt Management by Nicholas 2020, domestic bonds are the dominant form of public debt in several Caribbean economies, most notably the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, where domestic bonds account for over 50% of total public debt. Further still, the IMF's Caribbean Regional Strategy 2019 shows that the largest creditors to Caribbean states today are multilateral institutions, private bondholders, and domestic lenders, not the targeted European powers. So, members of the opposition, let me ask a simple but unavoidable question. Did institutions such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund enslave Africans? Did private bondholders operate plantations? Did our local banks extract unpaid labor for centuries? Of course not. And this is where the opposition's case collapsed. It is not enough to say that high debt is merely a ripple effect of colonialism and slavery. Reparations are not about tracing indirect consequences across centuries. They are about assigning responsibility for specific historical crimes. When debt forgiveness asks modern financial institutions and domestic creditors to pay for slavery, responsibility is misdirected, accountability is diluted, and justice is confused with convenience. Debt forgiveness may ease fiscal pressure, but easing pressure is not the same as repairing historical wrong. Reparations demand that those who caused the harm and those who directly benefited from it be the ones who repair it. Anything less is justice. Anything less is not justice. It is mislabeling. Mr. Speaker, debt forgiveness treats historical injustice like canceling a parking ticket instead of returning stolen property. Like penalty is removed, but the theft is never repaired. Monetary compensation is superior because it restores the correct relationships between perpetrator and victim. Unlike debt cancellation, which routes responsibility through banks and creditors, monetary compensation flows directly from those who committed and benefited from the crime to the societies that endured it. It preserves moral clarity. Further, monetary compensation is additive rather than subtractive. Debt cancellation merely removes a constraint. It stops money from leaving. Monetary compensation actively transfers resources to repair harm that was inflicted and wealth that was extracted. It enables investment in education, health, infrastructure, and institutional capacity, precisely the areas systematically undermined by slavery and colonial rule. Mr. Speaker, let me be equally clear. We are not uncritical advocates of monetary compensation either. Mr. Speaker, reparations were never meant to be easy, comfortable, or convenient. It is not enough for European powers to solve the problem with a checkbook. However, even with those limitations, monetary compensation remains conceptually and morally superior to debt cancellation. Mr. Speaker, ultimately, our preference is not for debt cancellation, nor even for simple monetary compensation. We are in favor of long-term developmental repair, support that meaningfully reverses the damage of slavery and colonialism in a sustainable and dignifying way. Canceling debt or transferring money can, in some cases, provide short-term relief, just as giving money to a homeless person can momentarily ease suffering. But relief alone does not guarantee transformation. Without structure, support, and long-term investment, the underlying vulnerability remains. And isn't that what the reparation movement is about? Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Charlemont High School representing the proposition side. We now call upon the first speaker from the opposition team. Of course, the opposition team is represented by Arima North Secondary School out of Trinidad and Tobago. We now invite the opposition leader to take the floor. Hear, hear.
Good morning, honorable adjudicators and fellow debaters. As the opposition, we firmly oppose this motion. We believe debt cancellation is an acceptable form of reparative justice. Let me define some terms. Reparations, as defined by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, are measures taken to repair harm caused by serious violation of human rights. These measures should include restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction. Debt cancellation refers to the forgiveness or removal of external debt owed by countries to foreign governments or international financial institutions. Let us begin. Caribbean debt is a direct consequence of slavery and colonialism. Caribbean nations did not inherit weak economies by accident. Under slavery and colonialism, Caribbean nations were built entirely for extraction. Extraction of wealth, labor, sugar, and land, not development. Local economies were denied the chance to accumulate wealth, to industrialize, or to diversify due to this extraction. And as a result, countries were left with weak economic bases at independence and had to turn to their former colonizers and financial institutions they controlled, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the IMF. You cannot blame nations for borrowing when they were never allowed to build. According to the IMF, the United States holds the most shares and largest voting power of 16.49%, which is considered a veto, followed by Japan, China, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, India, Russia, and Brazil, 5 of which are former colonizers. This is not coincidence. This is continuity. This is modern-day slavery. The CARICOM Reparations Commission, CRA, explicitly acknowledges this in its 10-point plan for reparatory justice, with point 10 being debt cancellation. The CRA states that they are still dealing with the colonial legacy that emerged from slavery and colonialism and the pressure to develop that has resulted in nations accumulating unsustainable levels of public debt that now constitute to their fiscal entrapment. Colonial legacies being defined as ongoing, enduring political, social, and cultural impacts of European imperialism. The proposition would have us believe that debt cancellation is where we draw the line, but somehow centuries of extraction were never too much. Caribbean nations borrowed because they inherited broken economies, and those broken economies, the result of extraction from slavery and colonialism. This suggests that debt is a consequence of enslavement that continues to impact nations today. This needs to be acknowledged and repaid. Debt is not separate from history. Debt is a consequence of it. And every dollar sent abroad in interest is a dollar not spent repairing the damage left behind. Under the United Nations framework of what reparations should include, debt cancellation meets those requirements. The United Nations states, and I quote, "Reparatory measures may include the following: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, and satisfaction." My proposition claims that debt compensation is lesser than monetary compensation, but do they not know that debt cancellation falls under compensation? And I'll define it for you. Compensation should be provided for any economically accessible damage, loss of earnings, loss of property, loss of economic opportunities, and moral damages. Rehabilitation should include medical and psychological care, legal and social services. Debt cancellation does both. By acknowledging and repairing the loss of economic opportunities nations could have benefited from, if not for extraction stemming from slavery and colonialism, and allowing rehabilitation within a nation by restoring autonomy to finally freely invest in and develop their own social services. According to the International Monetary Fund, external debt refers to obligations owed by non-residents that require future payment of principal and interest. This debt diverts money away from a country's social services, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure, further deepening the cycle of poverty. Thirdly, debt cancellation is just a part of reparatory justice, but it is not the only one. Is debt cancellation an acceptable form of reparative justice? Yes. But is it the only one? No. Debt cancellation does not stand alone. Just as in the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, debt cancellation is placed alongside other forms of reparations, such as formal apologies, development initiatives, educational support, health programs, and cultural restorations. Debt cancellation is not a shortcut or evasion of responsibility, as my proposition would have you believe. It is a tool in a comprehensive justice system that recognizes historical harm produced long-term economic consequences that still affect Caribbean societies today. Ignoring debt cancellation outright ignores the reality that harm did not end with emancipation and independence. It evolved. Debt cancellation is not about rewriting history. It is about acknowledging that wealth was extracted, development was denied, economic opportunities were lost. And when independence was granted without stable economic foundations, borrowing became unavoidable. Extraction, slavery, and colonialism are part of our history, and debt is a consequence of it. If reparatory justice is to mean anything, we must address consequences, not just commemorate causes. If reparatory justice refuses to acknowledge consequences, then it is not justice, it is performance. And for those reasons, we firmly oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First speaker, the leader of the opposition from Arima North Secondary School rather. All right, so we enter now our first segment of cross-examination. As I explained before, we're going to call upon the opposition team, Arima North Secondary School, to open with their 3 questions posed to Charlemont High School. Arima North, you may begin.
The Charlemont High School. My first question. If reparatory justice are meant to repair harm, why do you exclude the economic structures through which that harm continues to operate?
Could you repeat, please?
If reparatory justice is meant to repair harm, why do you exclude the economic structures through which that harm continues to operate?
We do not exclude the economic structures through which that harm continues to operate. We just exclude debt cancellation because debt cancellation does not suddenly lead to like economic development.
Arima North, you may proceed with your second question.
Can the proposition clearly state what does qualify as an acceptable form of reparation and explain why debt cancellation fails that same standard?
Well, all of the points stated by the CARICOM 10-point plan is an acceptable point of is an acceptable form of reparation, except that cancellation, because debt cancellation fails to like take responsibility for one's actions, because by canceling debt, how does that suddenly lead to development? Well, countries are still indebted. Like most of the countries that are in debt today are not even because of like colonial like powers. Most of the debt is not like linked to slavery. Even Trinidad and Tobago, most of the debt that they face is because of like local creditors. And even analysis by the International Monetary Fund show that 50% of Caribbean like internal debt, like 50% of debt is internal and not external, sorry. So that's why.
International frameworks like the UN recognizes that compensation and rehabilitation are forms of reparation. On what legal basis does the proposition exclude debt cancellation from these categories?
Could you repeat, please?
Sure. International frameworks like the UN recognizes that compensation and rehabilitation are forms of reparation, as I said in my argument. On what legal basis does the proposition exclude debt cancellation from these categories?
I think you're misunderstanding. We did not say that we exclude them as a part of reparation. What we exclude is the fact that debt cancellation is used in order to solve these modern economic problems. The fact is,
debt cancellation cannot stand on its own.
And as such, these modern problems are What is justice if only these problems are solved mandatory and not for future crises such as hurricanes and stuff like that? Like, for instance, the hurricane that took place in Jamaica the other day, Hurricane Melissa, it required a lot of funds to be borrowed. And as such, debt cancellation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So with that, we've completed the first segment, the first phase of this cross-examination segment. We now invite Charlemont High School to pose their 3 questions to Arima North Secondary School.
Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, yes, we are.
How does canceling debt guarantee that former colonial powers take responsibility rather than simply walking away from reparations altogether?
Former colonial governments cannot walk away from reparations altogether unless it is agreed to do so by both parties. This is remembered by legality. Unless it is explicitly stated in an agreement between both parties, then moral and legal justice is not served.
Our second question is, if the IMF admits countries are never truly free from debt, then how can debt cancellation suddenly development?
The IMF. Please repeat your question.
If the IMF admits that countries are never truly free from debt, then how can debt cancellation suddenly deliver development?
Debt cancellation does not suddenly deliver development. It frees tied assets in a country to finally invest in their own social services, such as the education system, the healthcare system, infrastructure, housing, and land. It helps develop an entire country and their citizens.
Is it fair that reparations depend on the country's debt level rather than their scale of historical harm?
I think you're mistaken. Debt cancellation is a form of reparations. Reparations are because harm was caused. Historical harm cannot be measured, and we cannot measure it. Therefore, it is an acceptable form of reparation.
All right. I think that is the third and final question from Charlemont High School. Thank you very much to both teams for that exciting exchange of questions and answers. We continue our debate now with the second speaker from Charlemont High School. This is the Deputy Prime Minister. Let's make that speaker welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant good day to you all. All protocols are established. Mr. Speaker, imagine a patient with a chronic illness caused by years of neglect. Each time the symptoms worsen, the hospital waives the bill. That may provide momentary relief, but the illness remains untreated. And because the condition persists, the patient returns again and again. At some point, we must accept that canceling the bill is not the same as curing the disease. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a practical problem with debt cancellation as reparation. My first speaker has shown why debt cancellation fails conceptually as reparation. I will now show that even if we ignore the moral theories entirely and judge this proposal purely on whether it works in practice, debt cancellation still fails. The opposition said debt cancellation frees up fiscal space that can be then used to achieve long-term development, but this logic is flawed. The central practical flaw is simple. Debt cancellation cannot operate as a durable reparatory mechanism because debt inevitably reaccumulates due to structural vulnerabilities that debt relief itself does not fix. Reparations are meant to address intergenerational harm. They are meant to leave society in a permanently improved position. Debt cancellation, however, is a one-off fiscal event that applies to an economic reality that is ongoing, volatile, and extremely exposed. Caribbean economies face repeated climate shock, narrow export bases, high import dependency, exposure to global interest rate cycles, pandemic, and commodity price volatility. These are not historical accidents, they are structural conditions. As long as they persist, debt will return. For example, Jamaica had made significant progress in reducing its debt. By the early 2020s, disciplined fiscal management had put the country on track in reducing its debt to GDP ratio to around 60%, a level far below previous decades. However, in the late October 2025, Hurricane Melissa, one of the costliest storms in the nation's history, struck Jamaica with a catastrophic force. The government estimates the damage to around 6 to 7 billion US dollars, roughly 28 to 32% of GDP, as infrastructure, tourism, agriculture, and services were severely disrupted. This is not theoretical. International Monetary Fund analysis of Caribbean small states consistently show that countries often re-enter debt distress within years of receiving relief because the underlying drivers of vulnerability remains unchanged. The practical term, the so-called reparation, disappears while the condition that creates the need for it remains intact. That alone undermines the opposition case. A repertory mechanism that dissolves over time cannot repair historical harm that is permanent. The opposition said that debt cancellation creates fiscal space for development. But, Mr. Speaker, fiscal space is not the same thing as structural transformation. The freeing up of budgetary room does not automatically diversify economies or climate improve infrastructure or build productive capacity. Without target long-term investment, vulnerability persists and debt returns. This exposes the second practical failure. Debt cancellation removes pressure but does not build resilience. It is subtractive, not addictive. It pauses harm, it does not reverse it. There is also a third practical problem. Debt cancellation, even extremely financed, risks microeconomic destabilization in small or open Caribbean economies. Even if European states were to pay off Caribbean debt in full, the economic effect would not be neutral. Large sudden injection of capital or debt write-down can destabilize domestic economies in several ways. First, debt payoff can fuel inflation pressures. When the government suddenly regains fiscal powers and receives large inflow, spending often raises faster than domestic productive capacity. In small imported dependent economies like those in the Caribbean, this increased demand leads into imports and higher prices rather than real output growth. This results in inflation that erodes purchasing power, especially those from the poorest household. In the opposition world, reparations are temporary, reversible, and contingent. But in our world, reparations are judged by whether they change trajectory, not just balance sheet. Mr. Speaker, a policy that is made that must be repeated indefinitely because it does not fix the underlying problem is not a solution. It is maintenance. Debt cancellation may ease today's pressure, but reparation must endure. And because debt cancellation cannot endure, it does not function as reparation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister from Charlemont High School. Again, Charlemont is from Jamaica, but our opposition team hails from Trinidad and Tobago. They are at the Arima North Secondary School. And now we invite their deputy opposition leader to present their speech within 6 minutes. Hear.
Reparations must empower victims. If a reparative measure does not restore agency, then it fails in its purpose. Debt cancellation is therefore a legitimate and essential form of reparation because it removes the final economic ties created by slavery and colonial exploitation and allows formerly colonized nations to provide for themselves. By canceling debt, nations regain the freedom to invest in their own economies, agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure. A nation that cannot feed itself or invest independently is not truly free. Political independence without economic control is freedom in name only. This understanding aligns with the United Nations program, which identifies economic sovereignty as a foundation for sustainable development. Haiti demonstrates why debt cancellation is reparative rather than charitable. After independence, Haiti was forced to pay and impose debt to former slaveholders, compensation for the loss of enslaved people. According to research cited by UNESCO, the World Bank, and economists such as Thomas Piketty, this debt drained Haiti's economy for generations. Resources that should have been invested in food systems, infrastructure, and public services were extracted instead. Canceling such debt directly corrects a historical harm, making it a reparative act. Now, to understand why debt cancellation is essential, we must first visualize what happens when it is denied. When debt is not cancelled, national revenue is locked into interest payments. Governments lose policy space. They cannot support farmers, invest in industry, or protect domestic markets. According to the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, this leads to weakened local production, not because people lack capacity, but because the state lacks financial freedom. As a result, countries become dependent on imports. Foreign corporations dominate food, energy, and telecommunications. Profit flows outward, competition disappears, and monopolistic conditions take hold. These economies are politically independent, yet economically captive. Burkina Faso illustrates this clearly. Although it gained political independence from France in 1960, its economy remained constrained by debt and external financial systems. However, in recent years, particularly under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso pursued debt relief, fiscal restructuring, and reduced reliance on external creditors. According to the IMF and World Bank estimates, GDP growth rebounded to around 5% in 2024, driven by increased state control over gold production, higher agricultural output, and reinvestment in local infrastructure. This is not coincidence. It demonstrates a core principle. When debt stops extracting wealth, nations regain agency. Resources once sent abroad can be reinvested at home, supporting food production, employment, and domestic industry. Even partial debt relief changes outcomes because it halts the automatic flow of national wealth. Opponents may argue that even if debt is cancelled, corrupt governments could misuse resources. However, reparations are not about trusting governments. They are about ending structural extraction. According to the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, 2024 report, 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on systemic development. This means that regardless of who governs, wealth is systemically diverted away from citizens. Cancelling debt keeps resources within national borders where democratic accountability and political reform can take place. Debt cancellation is also recognized in global practices. After World War II, Germany received extensive debt relief under the 1953 London Debt Agreement, allowing it to rebuild its economy. While Germany's case was not colonial reparations, it proves the principle. Debt cancellation is a legitimate tool for restoring stability and growth. If it was justified to rebuild Europe, it is even more justified as a reparative justice for nations whose debt originates in slavery and colonial exploitation. This logic is already reflected internationally through initiatives such as the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which acknowledges that some debts are unsustainable and unjust. In conclusion, debt cancellation is not charity. It is a reparative justice in economic form. It restores agency, prevents monopolistic dependency, and allows formerly colonized nations to become their own providers and healers. A nation that cannot feed itself or invest independently is not truly free. For these reasons, debt cancellation is not optional. It is essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's the second speaker from Arima North, representing the opposition's case. All right, we continue now this time with the second segment of cross-examination. The rules in terms of timing will remain the same, 10 seconds for each question, 45 seconds for each response. But this time we're going to invite first the questions coming to us from the proposition team, Team Charlemont High School. Charlemont, you're up, and just inviting all debaters to ensure that their microphones are kept unmuted so that we can have a free flow of questions and answers. Charlemont, you may begin.
Okay, so for the first question, if debt cancellation is effective, why has debt relief programs in the Caribbean not ended under development?
We can't quite hear you. Could you repeat your question?
Okay, so if debt cancellation is effective, why has debt relief programs in the Caribbean not ended under development?
There are currently no debt relief programs in the Caribbean unless you would like to provide some sources for that. That's assuming that there are and they are underdeveloped.
Please proceed with your second question, Charlemont High School.
Is it fair that reparations depend on a country's debt level rather than the scale of historical harm?
I believe this question would have been asked in the first cross-examination row. Would you like to ask it again?
How is justice served if colonial powers cancel debt without admitting responsibility for slavery and genocide?
So as I would have said in my argument, debt cancellation is an acceptable form, but it is not the only one. And just as in the Caribbean reparations plan for reparatory justice, it is accompanied by others, such as formal apologies, acknowledgement of harm, financial compensation, healthcare institutions, and educational programs.
Charlemont, you may ask your third and final question.
Okay. Doesn't that cancellation let you power centuries of to a number they get calculated and forgive?
I think the connectivity was bad there. Could you repeat?
Doesn't that cancellation let European powers reduce centuries of colonial harm to a number they get to calculate and forgive?
No.
Yeah, once it's all done, not the breakdown.
And then, can you repeat the connection again? We didn't hear the question. Sorry about that.
Okay, so doesn't debt cancellation let European powers reduce centuries of colonial harm to a number they get to calculate and forgive?
No. Debt cancellation does not allow, well, first of all, reparations are meant to repair harm. So debt cancellation is a form of reparation, and it establishes it assesses the economic damages and repairs it. So it does repair harm, but it does not allow colonial nations to just erase history.
As well as the UN, as I stated in my argument, the UN also does not agree with this currently and finds it illegal.
Okay, thank you very much for that segment, that phase of cross-examination. We continue now, this time with the questions coming from Arima North Secondary School out of Trinidad and Tobago. Arima, you may begin.
Okay. Question: if debt cancellation has been used in post-conflict and post-oppression contexts internationally, why do you deem it unacceptable in cases rooted in slavery and colonialism?
Could you please repeat?
Okay. If debt cancellation has been used in post-conflict and post-oppression contexts internationally, such as Germany, Haiti, and Burkina Faso, why do you deem it unacceptable in cases rooted in slavery and colonialism?
We deem it as unsatisfactory because slavery, which is the genocide of people and the forceful enslavement of them, is something that cannot be paid with mere monetary figures and monetary compensation. It should focus on addressing the historical harm through development, and debt cancellation is letting European powers think that they can solve everything with money, and we should not let them be in power still when they were in power over us for so much centuries.
And canceling debt does not fix the problem of historical harm.
My next question is, do you accept that modern financial institutions benefit from capital accumulated during colonialism? And if so, why does that benefit not carry responsibility?
Could you repeat, please?
Sure. Do you accept that modern financial institutions benefit from capital accumulated during colonialism? And if so, why does that benefit not carry responsibility?
Sorry, we're not hearing properly. Could you please repeat again? Sorry.
No problem. Which one? This? Yeah. Okay. Oh, not like that. Do you accept modern financial institutions benefit from capital accumulated during colonialism? And if so, why does that benefit not carry responsibility?
Firstly,
Are you hearing us clearly?
Yeah.
are you hearing us?
Yes, we can
Yes,
hear
we
you.
can hear you.
So firstly, most of the debt is not tied to historical or colonial exploitation today. Most of the debt is modern and linked to companies like the IMF and other companies. So there's barely any benefit, if any.
And in addition to that, it's the fact that we have to borrow from companies such as IMF, which did not colonize us. So it is indeed the responsibility by our colonizers to give back as reparation to the countries.
Not through debt cancellation.
And not through debt cancellation.
That's the question.
How does the proposition propose to repair generational economic harm without addressing the national economic structures that transmit that harm?
You say we do not address the national economic structures, but that falls under development. And you said that debt cancellation does not suddenly lead to development. So how does it benefit us as Caribbean nations then? By canceling debt, right, we will not suddenly have institutional or economical structural development because we will still be indebted in modern way, and modern debt is different from historical debt.
Sorry to
And however,
interrupt.
IMF.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you misunderstood the question. We asked how the proposition proposes to
Sorry,
repair.
Arima North? Arima North?
Mhm.
Or so you aren't allowed to do that. Just allow
My
them to complete the response. Thank you.
apologies.
That's all right. Continue with your response, Charlemont.
So as I was saying, most of the debt, as IMF data analyzes that, Caribbean states will never be free from modern debt. We're always stuck in a cycle of indebtedness and we're always borrowing, borrowing, borrowing. So clearing debt really does not benefit us. And most of the Caribbean states, they're not linked. They're not tied to colonial exploitation. The debt is not tied to colonial exploitation.
Okay,
And
thank
also,
you. Sorry, I'm sorry, you're out of time. Apologies. All right, so that concludes the second segment of cross-examination. We're going to pause now for 1 minute to allow both teams to put the finishing touches on their reply speeches. At the end of the 1 minute pause, we'll begin with the reply speaker from Team Arima North Secondary School, followed by the reply speaker from Charlemont High School. All right, your 1 minute begins now. All right, that concludes the 1 minute pause, and we're ready to resume our debate. Let us now invite the reply speaker from Arima North Secondary School, standing in opposition to the motion. All right, let's have that speaker commence their presentation. Of course, your presentation is limited to 5 minutes.
I could go ahead. Good day. At the heart of this debate lies a fundamental question. What does reparative justice actually require? Reparations are not simply about acknowledging historical injustice. They are meant to repair the long-term damage caused by that injustice. Where the harm inflicted was economic in nature, meaningful repair must engage directly with economic realities. Caribbean nations did not emerge from slavery and colonialism with stable economies. Instead, they inherited systems deliberately structured for extraction rather than development. Wealth was removed, opportunities for capital was denied, and economic independence wasn't fully established. When political independence eventually came, so did borrowing. Not because of reckless decision-making, but because of weakened economic foundations. The debt many Caribbean nations now carry is therefore not detached from history, it is a continuation of it. This makes debt cancellation irrelevant and serious consideration within any discussion of reparatory justice. Under the United Nations framework, reparations include both compensation and rehabilitation. Debt cancellation satisfies these criteria by compensating for lost economic opportunities and rehabilitating national economies through the redirection of resources. Funds used for debt payments can instead be redirected to healthcare, education, and social development, all of which are essential for long-term national stability. More importantly, reparations must do more than address finances. They must restore agency. Debt cancellation removes the final economic constraints that continue to limit development. Political independence without economic control is freedom in name only. The case of Haiti illustrates this clearly. After gaining independence, Haiti was forced to pay an imposed debt to their former slaveholders, a financial burden that drains the economy up until today. Resources that could support healthcare and education are diverted toward debt obligations. Debt cancellation in this context is not symbolic, it restores the capacity of nations to act in their own interests. Critics may argue that debt relief risks misuse by governments. However, this argument places perfection before justice. According to the United Nations Conference of Trade and Development in 2024, over 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt interest than on health and education. Canceling death holds this automatic outflow of resources and creates space for accountability, democratic reform, and sustainable governance. Freedom must come before perfection. Debt cancellation also establishes an important global precedent. Movements such as the Jubilee 2000s and initiatives like the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative Program demonstrates that international financial systems can change when injustice is recognized. The United Nations has further linked excessive debt to violations of human rights, reinforcing that debt relief is not only economic policy, but a moral and legal responsibility. Burkina Faso shows that political independence alone is not enough if economic control is still limited. Despite gaining independence in 1960, its economy remained constrained by debt and external influence. Only due to recent efforts for greater control of resources, such as increased agricultural output and investment in local infrastructure, agency has been restored. Not only limited to slavery and colonialism, debt cancellation is also recognized in global practice. After World War II, Germany received extensive debt relief under the 1952 London Debt Agreement, allowing it to rebuild its economy. While Germany's case was not colonial reparations, it proves the principle that cancellation is a legitimate tool for restoring stability and growth. When the arguments are weighed, the opposition's position offers a more comprehensive and practical response to historical injustice. It addresses the past by acknowledging economic extraction, the present by easing physical pressure, and the future by enabling sustainable development. Honorable adjudicators, debt cancellation is not charity, it is emancipation in economic and legal form. It restores agency, enables self-determination, and empowers formerly colonialized nations. For these reasons, we firmly stand against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for concluding the case on behalf of Arima North Secondary School. That was the reply speaker from the opposition side. We now conclude our debate with the presentation from the third speaker, the reply speaker from Charlemont High School. Let us make that speaker welcome.
Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I'm going to begin my rebuttal in 1, 2, 3. Mr. Speakers, members of the opposition, distinguished adjudigators, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We side government stand firmly in support of this. Be it resolved, this House rejects debt cancellation as an acceptable form of reparation. Firstly, the opposition has not outlined any of the points proposed by the proposition. If you do not acknowledge historical justice, how can harm be repaired? Let's say, for example, us as children turn into grown adults. Our parents have neglected us for over the past years, and in return, they gave us money for compensation. That does not solve what has happened to us, the emotional trauma, and what we have gone through as children growing up. Justice is not fully served, and that is why debt cancellation is the 10th point on the 10th rule and the 10th action on the 10-point plan. Secondly, debt cancellation is not relevant. What is relevant is the fact what is relevant is the fact that debt cancellation what matters is that reparation must address current underdevelopment. It tackles poverty, as my opponent has said, but really it is linked to historical factors. However, as our colonizers, debt cancellation may have economic value, but value alone does not make something reparated. Reparation are corrective but structural. They mend permanently address systems that produce harm, not temporarily ease the pressure. And as such, debt cancellation is not a acceptable form of reparation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, third speaker, reply speaker from Charlemont High School. Thank you for concluding our debate. At this time, we as the adjudicators will leave to deliberate, weigh the arguments, analyze the contributions that have been made so far, and then we'll return shortly with the results and the analysis.
Hello, I'm Hillary McLean from the Charlemont High School. Reparations are essential because the deep wounds of slavery and colonialism still affect our communities today, limiting access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Reparations are about justice, healing, and creating a fair chance for all Caribbean people to thrive. By acknowledging this history, we can build a stronger and more equal future together. That's why reparations matter now.
Good morning, judges. Today, we stand with one goal: justice.
Reparations repair the harm caused by slavery and colonialism.
They help us face the past and fix inequalities we still see today.
Reparations can rebuild trust and bring healing to our people.
They create better access for education, healthcare, and opportunities across the Caribbean.
Join us as we will debate for fairness, progress, and a better future.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparation so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional / international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. the future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Equiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and two, the harm is is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation. And 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo. The history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also
Point of information
that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is the segment where we provide the results on the match that just ended. The match featured a keenly contested debate between Charlemont High School out of Jamaica and Arima North Secondary School out of Trinidad and Tobago. They contested, they questioned, they interrogated whether or not debt forgiveness is an appropriate form of reparations for, I imagine, post-colonial states. All right, so let's just dig into the debate first of all. Charlemont High School tells us that when we're talking about reparations, it must be that the punitive action, the entity, the country even that is tasked with repaying has to be the one who perpetrated the crime to begin with. And they say that, first of all, in the international realm, the IMF and the World Bank, who have provided loans rather, to Caribbean states, were not themselves the perpetrator of the violence of colonialism and enslavement. And so there is not a justification in their estimation for there to be reparations in that form, in the form of debt forgiveness from these institutions, these multilateral organizations. They say also that you would have a situation where there is not a direct link between the treatment of the issues resulting and flowing from enslavement, from colonialism, and also the solvency of these issues. So, in other words, the debt is forgiven, but then there's not a mechanism by which the increased liquidity that would flow from debt forgiveness will be used, therefore, for to remedy things like infrastructural development, to ensure that, for example, we have better schools and all the various things that are inadequate currently because of the period of enslavement, because of colonialism. And they say, finally, as well, that there is not a justification for debt forgiveness because debt forgiveness is not, that these countries, rather, the Caribbean countries, aren't, generally speaking, the possessors and the holders of tremendous amounts of debt from these multilateral organizations. Most of the debts, they say, are domestic bonds, and so there's not a significant enough pool of monies that are owed by Caribbean states, owed to the IMF, owed to the World Bank, so as to justify sufficient reparations in this form. Those are the major concerns raised by Charlemont, raised in the speech of the first speaker from Charlemont High School, the Prime Minister. Of course, we get a fair amount of pushback from Arima North on these concerns. They say, one, in most instances, the IMF and the World Bank and other multilateral organizations that provide debt to the Caribbean states, they are primarily owned, managed, financed, supported financially by countries that were colonial powers themselves. And so there is, in their estimation, a direct link between debt forgiveness and the obligation of these colonial powers to pay for those kinds of harms. They point to two examples. Germany, which they highlight repeatedly, is not a direct reflection of debt forgiveness because of colonialism, because of enslavement, but they say that the principle remains the same, that in as much as Germany, having had its debt wiped off by Britain, was able to use the increased liquidity to fund infrastructural development and so forth, then in similar fashion, they envision that debt forgiveness to the Caribbean countries would be used in like manner. They also point to Burkina Faso and raise evidence of how it is that Burkina Faso has used debt forgiveness and increased funding that is no longer obligated to be used for debt servicing to enhance and to provide sustainability for the agricultural sector at large. We contend that there was a sufficient sort of articulation on the part of Arima North to linking a lot of the remedies that are necessary remedies that are necessary from to the issues that result from enslavement and colonialism to debt servicing. So what do I mean by that? We think that a lot of the issues that are existent within the current status quo can in fact be solved based on a presentation from Arima North through debt servicing. It might not be adequate, and Arima North concedes to that, but Arima North points to the fact that this motion does not say we're talking about debt services only, It doesn't say that debt servicing is provides full solvency to the reparations issue, but it does provide a key starting point, if you will, for the remedying of the ills that would have flowed from enslavement and colonialism. And they point to the Caribbean 10-point plan, which speaks to other areas by which there could be appropriate solvency for debts for colonialism and enslavement. Right? We think overall that this debate could have benefited from more direct engagement. So, for instance, why is it that the IMF and the World Bank, albeit minority sort of lenders to the Caribbean states, why is it that they should bear the burden of debt forgiveness? We felt that some great analysis was needed beyond simply pointing to the major countries that are donors to the IMF and the World Bank, and that they are colonial powers themselves or former colonial powers themselves, and therefore, they would effectively, by extension, be faced with a significant amount of the responsibility and burden of this debt forgiveness. We would like to have heard as well from Arima North some mechanism beyond the examples provided by from Germany and Burkina Faso, some examples that would cause us as a panel to be convinced that there is likely to be not the wastage of the increased funds that are available through debt cancellation. Caribbean countries currently have oftentimes a constitutional obligation to pay the debt first before they provide infrastructural and other kinds of development for their societies. We'd have liked to have understood what mechanisms are there that will force these Caribbean countries or incentivize these Caribbean countries to ensure that the debt that has been forgiven, the funds that are now freed up, because no longer will these Caribbean countries have to pay the debt, will be used, in fact, for infrastructural development and so forth. In the final analysis, the judges scored the two teams. The winning team gets 280 points as compared to the second place team's 261 points. The winners of this first match in the International Reparations Debate Competition 2026 is Arima North Secondary School. Congratulations to Arima North Secondary School.
Thank you.
On doing a fantastic job. And of course, very well tried. Very, very strong attempt from Charlemont High School. We also have another important announcement, the announcement as it relates to the best debater. The best debater is the Deputy Prime Minister. Sorry, not the Deputy Prime Minister, my apologies. The Deputy Opposition Leader from Arima North. Congratulations to the second speaker from Arima North Secondary School on topping this match in relation to receiving the high score. All right. So with that, we've come to the end of this first match. Thank you so very much for tuning in and for sort of enjoying this debate. We know you did. We know you've learned and benefited from participating rather in this debate. We look forward to having you on board next time when we see two other teams facing off in the 2026 rather. The 2026 International Reparations Debate Competition. Of course, we invite both teams now to exchange pleasantries with each other as we get ready to depart. So, Charlemont?
We want to congratulate Arima North Secondary for match well played, and we wish you all the best on the behalf of Charlemont High School.
All right, and Arima? Arima North?
Thank you for your comment. We want to thank you all for your time and your participation. We appreciate all of the effort that you put in Charlemont, and we saw the dedication in it, and we loved it as well. Congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so very articulate and so very kind and congenial both schools are to each other. All right, take care. See you during the second match of the day. This is the 2026 staging of the International Reparations Debate Competition.